It's a pleasure for me to be again with you and to discuss and think together about this huge crisis that we have in front of us in order to see how the international cooperation may restart and give us some concrete solution in order to get out from this pandemic and to recover from the economic point of view and also to recover from the security point of view. I will also use some images and some slides. So now I will try to show to you these slides and I will follow this plan that I had in front of myself. So first of all, the subject is the global health crisis and danger for democratic principles in Southeastern Europe. So we will discuss about democracy, what are democratic principles and how, of course, this crisis represented a threat for the respect of democratic principles. This is a very delicate issue and we should be very careful about discussing about that. But I think is one of the basic aspects of the international cooperation. So first of all, we will consider together which was the coronavirus pandemic in the world. We will take a couple of minutes to have a flash on which is today's situation. And in the second step, we will also check which was the reaction of the different countries. They were looking, of course, for solution in order to recover without panic. And this is another fundamental aspect, crucial aspect, because when we have a very important crisis, we have to avoid panic. It's not easy sometimes to avoid panic. In the third point, we will also consider what are the democratic principles. Of course, we need the transparency. We want to take care about the health care, and also we want to relaunch international cooperation, how to handle and to manage these aspects in order to preserve those principles. Then we will focus our attention on Southeastern Europe area, and we will try to underline which is the danger for democratic principles. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, the danger does not exist only in Southeastern Europe, it exists all over the world. So, of course, we will focus our attention on Southeastern Europe, but we have to consider that the same problem exists in many other countries, including my country, which is Italy. And then we will go toward conclusion. So in about 15 minutes, we will try to create a brainstorming so that maybe we will also raise some questions during a debate that will be moderated later on by the president of the Croatian Atlantic Council. So, ladies and gentlemen, first point, the coronavirus pandemic and the world. Obviously, we have nowadays an image of the world. Nowadays, we have close to 25 million infections all over the world, and we are approaching the 1 million deaths. So this is a terrible aspect. If we look at the figures, and you can see in this map the areas in which the coronavirus has been hitting the societies, we can see that Asia, a lot of European countries, Southern America, and North America are highly involved in this. And we don't see countries that found an incredible solution, a fantastic solution. We are looking for, of course, health solution as a vaccine, but we do not yet have particular measures that may justify optimism. We are talking in the end of August, beginning of September 2020. If we also have a look on the forecast that the International Monetary Fund published a few months ago in April 2020, of course the forecasts are extremely pessimistic. As you may see, mainly all over the world, we will have a huge recession in Asia, mainly in Russia, in Europe, in Australia, in South America, and North America. Only few countries in Asia might still have some growth in 2020. But we still consider that the figures that the International Monetary Fund published in April were too optimistic. now we are more pessimistic about those figures. If we go to see the numbers, for instance, concerning Europe, you may see, everybody may see that in Europe, in this column, which is projections for 2020, we have minus almost everywhere. In some countries, huge minus. In Italy, almost minus 9.1, maybe minus 10. And in Greece, more or less the same. And also in the other countries, if we have a look on Southeastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe countries, we can see that we have minus almost everywhere, even though in some countries we have less recession than in some Western countries. That would be, of course, a positive aspect for them, but we have to see if the authorities will manage how to master, of course, the crisis and how to avoid other political instabilities. Then, of course, if we have to consider how the administrations they were reacting to the crisis, they were looking for solutions in order to recover without panic. And in Italy, in France, in Germany, in Spain, in UK, the politicians, they were approaching the societies, and the first solution was locking down. But ladies and gentlemen, lockdown was, of course, a need, but what was extremely interesting was the balance, how much to lock down. And in Italy, for instance, we consider that the government has been reacting quite quickly, even though it could have been reacting even more quickly. In any case, today the society is quite satisfied about the reaction. But you remember that in March, Italy was, after China, the most affected country of the world. And the situation was extremely difficult. And the risk of panic was absolutely real risk. So the government has been trying on one side to transfer rigid and I would say binding conditions on one side. On the other side, they tried to manage to approach the population without transferring the sense of panic, even though in some areas of Italy, such as in Lombardia, in Bergamo, in Brescia, the situation in the hospital was absolutely tragic situation, and the health authorities were not able to manage the situation at that moment. So the risk of panic was existing, and in some areas we did have panic. But on the other side, as I was saying, we need to recover without panic. But how other countries have been managing this? In Germany, for instance, also the government of Germany, of Angela Merkel, they tried to transfer quite a moderate message in order to resolve the problem without transferring the sense of nerve to the population. Moreover, we have to say that Germany had the advantage of having more infrastructure, health infrastructure, to take care about the population. In France, probably they reacted very late compared to the situation, as in Spain, they reacted very late. So now we have to consider, of course, the issue of democratic principle, transparency, healthcare, and international cooperations. So transparency, when shall we communicate? When the government should communicate about the emergency? In Italy, they try to immediately transfer that. We have the sensation that in some countries, they didn't. So, for instance, let's take the example of Spain and France. There were the issue of some, for instance, social meetings. We consider that in the beginning of March 2020, in Spain, the government wanted to celebrate, for instance, the Day of the Women on the 8th of March, and they did not make any sort of restriction. In France, they also had the municipal political elections, and they didn't want to cancel the first tour of this. And right after that, the government and the President Macron intervened with the lockdown. That was in the middle of a huge quarrel. So the public opinion attacked the government by saying the government was not responsible. And the government, in this sense, was not enough, I would say, aware about the emergency and the measures that they had to transfer. So, in general, when we need to consider to take care about the democratic principle, we need, of course, to link the issue of democracy. What is democracy? Is the government of the people, but that means also not only the government of the people, but freedom and transparency. So democracy is highly connected with the need of communications and transparency. But on the other side, there is what they call in France, and we call it in Italy, of course, la raison d'etat, la ragion di Stato, which means the state reason, the state need. So the government has in its hands, on one side, the will to respect democracy and democratic principle, but on the other side, they also need to preserve the state reason, la raison d'etat. And on the other side, they try to balance on how much transferring the figures and how much hiding the figures. And that happened in the most democratic countries. So the public opinion, sometimes they have the perception that the government did not transfer all the figures as they should have done. This is a very important aspect. Then we also had the need of the international cooperations. And in the middle of that, there was the role of the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization, in some countries, I mean, most of the countries, including mainly the United States of America, the people and the government administration were thinking that the World Health Organization was not acting in a proper way. They should have acted in a much more, I would say, active way to try to contain the illness and the virus. Then we also had individual initiatives. Some countries started to help other countries. When Italy was in the middle of the pandemic and the most advanced status of pandemic in the middle of March, Italy received several help from other countries. We received delegation from China. We received 100 doctors from Russia. We received some doctors from Albania and even from Cuba. So some unexpected countries would have helped in a moment in which Italy was extremely hit by this pandemic. But then we were also assisting to the issue, to the big competition to create a vaccine. And for instance, very recently, Russia announced that they were able to, they succeeded to prepare a vaccine, but there was a huge reaction in the Western countries that were very skeptical about that, about the efficacy of that vaccine. They were skeptical about the procedure that Russia has been following in order to prepare this vaccine. But the population, they were just waiting for a relevant vaccine, for a vaccine that would work and help people to be much more protected in front of this illness. I also would like now to go to Southeastern Europe and to focus our attention on those countries. If we have a look on this area, which is the crucial area that we are in the middle of our attention, we can see that those countries are considered to be a bit less advanced compared to some Western European countries, but nevertheless, if we have a look on the issue of democratic principle, we had the example again of some political elections. We had the cases in France, in Spain before, but also we had the case of Serbia. And you remember that probably the government was not transferring all the, I would say, the real data concerning the infection in order to not to compromise the importance of the elections that they had. As a matter of fact, right after the election, we had a huge increase of infections, for instance, in Serbia. A lot of a lot of controversies and reactions by the public opinion against the president and against the government. That was an example of issue concerning transparency, democratic principle in Southeastern Europe. I also would like to mention how important is for Croatia the issue of tourism. Croatia needs tourism, as not only Croatia, also Montenegro needs tourism. Those countries, they have to balance, of course, the issue of lockdown with the interest of not killing the tourism during the summer season. And we have been assisting to a behavior by the government, which was mainly led by the common sense, which means to be very careful about the increase of infection, but not lock down the country during summer in order not to kill completely the economy of the country. How was it? Was it good? Was it bad? We have, of course, we can start with a huge debate in this sense and compare our point of view. Personally, I think that the government, they didn't have other solution than trying to balance both aspects. Transparency concerning the reality of the infections, and on the other side, keeping the doors open for a moderate tourism. In some areas, it is not a moderate tourism. Everybody knows, for instance, that in the island of Pag in Croatia, people, they are going there to make party day and night. And people from all over Europe, they want to go to Croatia for that, but that has an impact on the infection. As it has in Italy, Sardinia Island, probably you have been reading on the newspaper that in the recent days, we had an increase of infections in Italy because of people coming back from Sardinia. They were going to have holidays in one of the most beautiful areas of the Mediterranean Sea, which is Sardinia, but there was an increase of infection. And we also had for instance, the case of other countries in Southeastern Europe, such as Bosnia and Herzegovina. For instance, there was the Congress of a company in Konic in the beginning of March, and then was the starting of the booming of the infection in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Moreover, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have the very specific political situation with the division with three entities, with the government which sometimes is compromised by the vetoes of the different ethnic groups. We have also the issue of religion. In Italy, we have to stop completely the religious activity. No people in the churches. The Pope that was celebrating Eastern Mass with the TV, that was absolutely unique in the history of religion, but there was the same issue in southeastern countries and mainly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we have a different religion. We have Christian Catholic, the Croats, we have Christian Orthodox, the Serbs, and we have Muslims, the Bosniaks, and the religious activity had to be stopped. Sometimes, as you know, religion is one of the flag of the identity of some group. Also in Albania and in North Macedonia, Albania in the beginning was not hit a lot, and it was representing an interesting case in Southeastern Europe. Albania, as I mentioned before, also helped some countries such as Italy, but then Italy had to help back Albania in July because the situation was deteriorating also in Albania, and we do not have evidence of the fact that the authorities denied the democratic principle. On the other case, we consider that the summer season was representing another big threat for all those countries, including also North Macedonia. North Macedonia, which has also a very important position in the heart of the Balkan region in Southeastern Europe. As we know, North Macedonia, which is also one of the big topic of discussion also for the security reason. Now we are going toward the conclusion in this sense. Why? Well, because first of all, this big global health crisis has been completely changing I would say, the the balance of this world from the economic point of view, but also from the strategic point of view. As we consider, for instance, that Southeastern Europe is a crucial area for the energy issues. As we know, the pipelines that should come from the southern part, from the Caucasus through Turkey, then they should go in Southeastern Europe and in Italy. The TANAP pipeline, the TAP, as we consider the TAP, that goes through not only through Greece, but also through Albania and then go to Italy. In Italy, we still have a huge debate in Puglia, in the southern region of Italy, that there is a huge debate of the public opinion because they don't want to build the infrastructure for the pipeline because of an ecological movement. You know, we have those aspects that intervenes a lot in the political decision. But not only this, if we consider also the issue of migrations, how important are the southeastern countries concerning the social aspect of migration. We have huge migration through the Balkan towards Central Europe, and countries such as North Macedonia, Serbia, but also Croatia, Hungary, Slovenia, they are all involved in this huge aspect. And there we have a problem because some of the countries are members of the European Union, some of the countries are not members of the European Union. So the strategy is not the same strategy, and sometimes we do not have the expected results. Then we also have the huge aspect concerning the new Silk Road. We had old Silk Road that were open very far in the past at the age of Marco Polo, and also before Marco Polo when he was opening new gates with Asia. And nowadays we have the new Silk Road going through the earth and going through the sea. And Europe is the target of that. And as we can see, the Southeast European countries are in the middle also of this very important project that would maybe in the future provide new prosperity and richness in our area. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to abuse of your time, but I would like also to end about an aspect concerning NATO. NATO, which is the security organization, NATO, which is nowadays reacting with, I would say, a low-profile attitude, but NATO, which is increasing its presence in Southeastern Europe. As we can see, North Macedonia was the last country to join. We have still some areas such as Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia that are not members of NATO, but as we know, probably those countries will never join NATO also because of the issues concerning the past, and it is absolutely understandable from the point of view of the public opinion. But what is NATO also provoking in the reaction in front of other countries such as Russia? And nowadays we have a new case of destabilization in Belarus, and we can see the different approach and the different position, the Western position, which is highly criticizing what's going on in Belarus, and on the other side, Russia, which is reacting in order to protect the independence of those countries and the fact that Russia does not want neither Ukraine nor Belarus to join the Western organization, and namely NATO. So there will be another trial between East and West in the next months and years in this sense. And in this trial, there will not only be Russia, but probably also there will be China. The political role of China will grow, in my opinion, in the next years. And as you can see, that today's presidential campaign in the United States of America, and mainly on the side of the Republicans, is focused on the trial in front of China in the next future. So Southeastern Europe will remain a crucial area for the stability of Europe, but before we obtain, in my opinion, the stability of Europe, we should provide the necessary harmony and serenity to the local countries in order to help them to find by themselves their own stabilization, because without their own stabilization, it will be difficult to have a stabilization of the whole Europe. That's why I thank you very much for your attention. And when we will meet in front of the screen, I will be more than happy to receive your questions, just in case, and also to receive your provocation, because also, as you know, provocation is one of the soul of good debates. Thank you very much for your attention.
My subject, or our subject for discussion, is NATO and European Union, values and interests concerning the Western Balkans. I want to deal with 5 subjects, briefly. The role of values for NATO and the European Union, values and interests and the connection between the two, the opposing powers, Russia and China, conflicts inside EU and NATO, and 5th, a joint approach or national orientation, or what could only also say transactional or transformational policies. To the first point, NATO and EU, the role of values. Both NATO and the European Union have been founded on the basis of values. You can find them in the Atlantic Charter and the North Atlantic Treaty, but especially, of course, in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. These documents define these principles. For example, the right of people to choose their governments, representative democracy, freedom of expression, individual liberty, impartial rule of law, minority rights, and so on. In reality, all these values are more and more contested and even violated. Inside NATO, for example, by Turkey, but also recently by the US, the example for that challenge and backsliding. Concerning the European Union, it's predominantly Hungary and Poland, who are also members of NATO, who are examples for grave concern. Now, my conclusion to the first point would be that NATO and even more the European Union are more than interest-based organizations. They are based on values. Unfortunately, some countries with growing tendencies are challenging and violating these principles. Nevertheless, the founding values and principles are guidelines for the collective policies of NATO and European Union. Now to my second point, values and interests. Values and interests are often interconnected. Sometimes interests are hiding behind publicly offered values. Overall, there is a tendency visible, especially now at the United States, to put economic and even personal presidential interest on top of the foreign policy agenda. With some euphemism, one can call it transactional policy, where only the result, especially the result for the president of the US, the deal, is important. Inside the European Union, the promotion of interests are used to underline very often national identity and also domestic political gains. Sometimes there's a special importance given to very restrictive Christian values in contradiction to the openness and libertarian values embedded in the Charter of the European Union. Now, my conclusion would be that the values are the more important, the more they are linked and connected with interests. And especially the European Union should make clear that it has an interest to have close ties with the Balkan countries, to have them on the way to join the European Union, but on the basis of the values or the principles of the European, especially the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. Third point, the differences with Russia and China. Looking to the political development in Russia and China and to their specific foreign security policy, one can see many differences between Russia and China on the one hand, NATO and European on the other hand. That's not only concerning the values and principles, but also the actual foreign policy. Russia, especially with President Putin, has partly not accepted the new borders after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. In the case of Georgia, Moldavia, Ukraine, maybe also now Belarus, you can see that attitude. Russia is in addition supporting authoritarian regimes and not really interested in democratic development. China is a bit different. It is not showing the same pattern of foreign policy, but rather using more economic instruments to strengthen their interest, at least in Europe. Concerning the South China Sea, Also, military power is used to expand Chinese interest and eventually perhaps or even territory. So my conclusion to that point would be, in spite of deviances from the values and principles and therefore some backsliding inside the West, European Union and NATO, there are fundamental differences to Russia's and China's domestic and external policies. The extension of influence and power and the support for authoritarian regimes, also in the Balkans, are in opposition to the principal policies of the European Union and also of NATO. But to oppose these policies of Russia and China should by no means mean to prevent an invitation to Russia and China to be involved into building a common peace structure also in Europe at large. The policy of decoupling promoted especially now by President US and the present administration is in effect endangering the collective responsibility for our common world. Now to my fourth point, the weakening of NATO and the EU due to internal disputes. The role of EU and NATO to give clear answers to the defaults but also aspirations of the Balkan country is connected also with the internal disputes. This concerns the basic democratic principles inside the EU, but also national antagonism inside NATO. The most up-to-date example is the political, maybe even military fight between Turkey and Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean. My conclusion is, it is always a mistake to leave open questions unresolved. Instead of putting all the efforts to solve the Cyprus issue and to use gas exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean to establish regional cooperation, EU and NATO left these questions open and did not try at least to establish a new regional cooperative order. Therefore, there should be a common effort for NATO and EU to solve the current issues from Kosovo to Bosnia and Herzegovina and not leave these questions and issues open. The last issue I want to deal with is, of course, the question if there should be rather a joint approach or more national orientation, or one could say, what's the advantage or disadvantage of a transactional approach versus the transformational policies. Now, in general, it seems that today national and even sometimes nationalistic policies, often promoted by authoritarian governments, are overtaking cooperative and collective endeavors. But these national and mostly bilateral efforts for conflict resolution have many limits. Recently, we could see that with the example of the US intervention to the Kosovo-Serbian conflict and the conference the US was organizing in Washington. The result, if you read the documents, concerns more Israel and the question of recognition of Israel or the recognition of Kosovo than the regional dispute between Kosovo and Serbia. So my conclusion would be, in spite of the rise of interest-based, transactional and bilateral political efforts by several governments, for example, the United States of America, collective and community-based policies have more and long-term effective results. For example, the stability gained for Europe after the Second World War and the transformation of Europe into a region of peace, cooperation, and respect for human rights was only possible through establishing a European Union and through the foundation of policy based on cooperation and of mutual respect. And also the military alliance, one has to confess, between the European Union and US helped in that way. So out of this reason, cooperation between the European Union and NATO, even if we have increasing difference with the US under President Trump, would be very necessary. So yes, the results of such policies cannot be shown always very in short term, but in the long term, I think that this cooperative, collective way to deal with politics is much better, and therefore also for the Balkans to have a stronger tie with the European Union on the one hand, but also with NATO, would be helping the transformation of the Balkans also in a peaceful region and the respect for human rights.
Hello, everyone. As a short introduction, my name is Korina Vukadinovic. I'm a graduated lawyer and vice president of the Atlantic Council of Croatia. First of all, let me thank Mrs. Begovic, President of Atlantic Council of Croatia, for organizing this interesting event, even in this, I could say, challenging times. Secondly, I would really like to thank you to actively participate in this webinar. I'm also looking forward to our upcoming discussions, and in order to have some basis for further analyzing and for posing the right questions, let me begin with my lecture. Everything I'm going to talk about today can be concise in one question. Could the COVID-19 crisis endanger or even weaken democracy? After a short introduction to the theme with examples of some governmental responses to the COVID-19 crisis, we will pass to some basic principles of democratic preferences during pandemic crisis management. That will lead us to the question of legitimacy during pandemic management, and we will finally conclude with some vital questions that can be actually your homework to think of before our soon discussion. While the COVID-19 pandemic produces a massive global public health crisis, it also poses an unprecedented global challenge for contemporary democracies in many respects. As French President Emmanuel Macron said, we are at war. Unlike other crises that the world encountered in the last few centuries, such as world wars, such as climate change or terrorism, COVID-19 represents a direct and practically uncontrollable life threat to millions of citizens worldwide, a proven catastrophic for all affected economies, and ground for often questionable legislation directly affecting civil liberties and rights. For months, as you know, over a third of the world has been placed under some sort of extraordinary measures, including complete lockdowns in numerous countries that lasted for months. The inexplicably fast spread of the pandemic and existing death rate triggered dramatic repressive responses of national governments. These responses comprise mostly of packages of extraordinary measures to fight the disease brought by each national state. Let me just evoke some of these measures. We had complete lockdowns, tracking movements of citizens, restrictions on freedom of assembly, mass surveillance, usage of smartphone-based tracking applications, mandatory social distancing, and many other temporary measures that can potentially actually curtail civil liberties on a massive scale, often without legitimacy. When talking in general, we can establish that so far the response to this global crisis has been led by the nation states, with lack of international joint response, even within the European Union and the most prominent international organizations, such as United Nations and even the World Health Organization. Numerous countries have already passed emergency laws or even declared states of emergency, which represent a perfect mechanism for leaders with autocratic preferences to consolidate power. For purposes of further analysis of legitimacy of measures taken under such regimes, let me just mention a few examples of broad laws. In Hungary, the government of Viktor Orban passed a law in March that allows the government to rule by decree and suspend existing laws. Furthermore, parliamentary oversight is suspended for the duration of the crisis, with only the Prime Minister permitted to determine when it will be lifted. The new law introduced draconian fines for spreading fake news and breaking quarantine and curfews, with penalties of up to 5 years of imprisonment. The law triggered a clear letter by Mrs. Pejcinovic-Buric, the Secretary General of the Council of Europe, which is the continent's key human rights watchdog, to the Hungarian government, stating that an indefinite and uncontrolled state of emergency cannot guarantee that the basic principles of democracy will be observed, and that the emergency measures restricting fundamental human rights must be strictly proportionate to the threats which they are supposed to counter. Another example is Serbia, our neighbor country, where social measures to fight the pandemic started on March 15, when a state of emergency was declared. One of these measures was a ban to leave a domicile, known as curfew, from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. that was established across the whole country. In addition, people aged over 65 were forbidden to leave the house, with fines up to approximately $1,500. In the first hours of curfew, several persons were even arrested. The curfew has been repeatedly prolonged, and in April it reached its maximum. Citizens were not actually allowed to leave their house for a whole 83 hours in a row. As you can imagine, these restrictions did not pass without any questions. Many argue initial declaration of the state of emergency was against the constitutions, since there was no debate about it in the Serbian parliament. Additionally, according to Serbian legislation, it can be declared only in the event of inability of the parliament's assembly, which was obviously not the case during the pandemic. Some experts furthermore argue an emergency situation could have been declared instead, and the state of emergency as a measure was actually an overreaction. Another example is Montenegro, the last European country to register a case of COVID-19 and subsequently the first corona-free country in May. The government published names and addresses of citizens who are supposed to be in quarantine to ensure compliance, which represents at first serious bypassing of all general data protection, regulation legislation, and basic individual rights on privacy of personal data. As a response to these measures and restrictions, we witnessed numerous protests worldwide. We even had one in Zagreb a few days ago. So now let's see how democratic preferences correlate to general compliance with restrictions of fundamental civil rights and liberties. When talking about current global democratic preferences, it is noteworthy to mention that according to the Freedom House, an NGO, 2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. In the light of said statistic, management of this world health threat poses a wide range of democratic dilemmas. Most notably, it represents the dilemma between globalism and nationalism, public health and civil liberties, and between political and technocratic governance. But the COVID-19 crisis also poses a massive collective action problem within the countries because of the highly contagious nature of the virus. The problem can be solved either by citizens' voluntary compliance and cooperation in social distancing, as we can see in Sweden, or by establishing exceptional government powers limiting basic civil liberties to impose quarantines and lockdowns, as in the case of the most countries worldwide, even in Croatia. To rephrase this dilemma, to what extent are citizens willing to trade off democratic principles and basic fundamental civil liberties and rights in exchange for protection against the pandemic? Pandemics represents a very large shock to public health and economy also, which in turn gives citizens the opportunity to learn about their governments based on their political and policy responses. Research on the effects of previous pandemics has found important and durable effects on social attitudes. For instance, the Black Death of the 14th century has been shown to have negatively affected cooperation and intergroup relation between people. Another survey has shown that the forced social distance and the social disruption caused by the Spanish flu had long-term negative consequences for social trust. So, all these effects are important because they can shift societies towards different, self-sustained social and political dynamics. Measures introduced during emergencies aren't easily dismantled. Just remember the September 11th terrorist attacks, which fundamentally changed airline travel for good. Many of you will recall how it became a lot more challenging to get through the security at the airport. But heightened fears also led to the Patriot Act, which gave the federal government vast new investigative powers that it claimed were necessary in order to fight terrorism. A terror attack and pandemic at first are vastly different, but they both represent opportunities for governments and the private sector to take on new powers in the name of keeping citizens safe. Based on theoretical and empirical antecedents, how can we expect that the COVID-19 outbreak will affect democratic preferences? It is arguable, as we saw, that the characteristics of the pandemic make it a solid potential case for eroding preferences for democratic governance, at least in the short run. According to an interesting survey that I found conducted in Spain in March 2020, COVID-19 has a sizable effect on democratic attitudes. Firstly, the survey showed that citizens expressed significantly more support for expert rule and technical approach to the management of public affairs than for politicians and regular democratic representation. Secondly, The results showed both a widespread of willingness to sacrifice basic civil liberties in order to contain pandemic and in higher support for strong leadership, even if it means authoritarian characteristics. In other terms, people appear to be willing to trade off protection against the virus for individual liberties and rights, at least in short terms. The following question seems to be posed in a right moment: whether this shift towards technocratic and authoritarian preferences will have long-lasting consequences, as we saw in some examples before, and will it prevail on legitimacy as an absolute principle of democracy. Let's see, do the restrictive measures brought globally fulfill all conditions in order to consider them as legitimate, but both from legal and from political aspect. As we are already all aware of, numerous countries have already passed emergency laws or declared states of emergency in order to fight this disease, meaning that the ordinary rule of law doesn't apply and technocratic government led by experts, not politicians, takes the main role in crisis management. In addition, usual checks and balances in states between executive and legislative power are suspended, and this situation appears to be fertile ground for suspension of basic civil freedom and rights, all under the parole of an adequate authoritarian response to health crisis. So, how can we theoretically define which temporary measures are not only medically adequate but also legitimate? Let's recall basic definition of legitimacy in legal aspect: conformity to the law. We can declare a temporary measure as legitimate if it is brought according to applicable legislation. And since we here talk about measures that pose restrictions on fundamental civil rights and freedoms, such as movement, the applicable rule will be mostly found in constitutions of countries. As we know, constitutions represent an aggregate of fundamental principles that govern fundamental rights and freedoms of citizens. So, the measures impacting such basic rights and liberties need to fulfill additional important conditions besides pure conformity with the law to consider them as legitimate from every aspect. Firstly, they need to be temporary. What does it mean? It means that they need to have exactly defined application period. Otherwise, they can slowly lead to a permanent state of emergency. Let's recall the law Viktor Orban, by which parliament is suspended, but only the prime minister is permitted to determine when it will be convened again. Secondly, type and level of restrictions posed by these measures needs to be objectively proportional to the threat they are supposed to counter. As an example of an unproportional measure, we can mention Israeli Prime Minister, who used the emergency to postpone his corruption trial and grant extraordinary domestic surveillance powers to the Internal Intelligence Agency, which was all clearly not a proportional answer to threats that pandemic causes. Lastly, they need to be fully transparent regarding their application. In fact, transparency and clear and open communication seems to be a vital part of success in confronting the coronavirus in countries like Taiwan or Singapore. In addition to these conditions that temporary measures need to fulfill in order to be considered fully legitimate, there are some more factors that add to an effective response to the pandemic, while ensuring at the same time that the critical debate remains alive. Firstly, we can mention independent media and parliamentary opposition. One of them are certainly also legislative bodies, which ensure and monitor legitimacy of all taken measures. Active legislative bodies can be found, for example, in Austria. The Austrian parliament passed a number of laws in an accelerated procedure, and the EU parliament supported special EU funds to help countries affected by the pandemics, all with most members participating and voting remotely. So, now we have some general overview about global response to this unprecedented health crisis, about its impact on democratic preferences of citizens, and about legitimacy as a legal must for imposing any measures restricting basic civil rights. The question that naturally poses in the end is, when it comes to a choice between protecting health and lives of people on one side and protecting democracy, rule of law, and basic civil rights on the other, which one will prevail? In my opinion, this choice is not binary, and the answer lies in balance. Thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to our further discussion. Bye.